The first mistake was calling it a cleanup. On the tactical overlay, the planet was a dull amber marble hanging against black, small, unremarkable, tagged with an old corporate identifier, instead of a name, Y976b. The briefing packet was only 3 pages long, which said more about how seriously Central took the mission than any speech from command ever could. Former Terran mining colony, the logistics officer had said, his frills twitching with boredom as he scrolled through the history. Atmospheric event. 2 centuries ago, oxygen crash, methane spike. Terrans bailed. Their equipment didn't. He flicked a claw and the display shifted to a scan of the surface. Jagged ridges, frozen hydrocarbon seas, flickers of thermal activity around rusted superstructures. Corporate wants the dig sites back. Local biosphere adapted to the new atmosphere and infested the old infrastructure. You are to neutralize the fauna around priority assets so reclamation teams can move in standard pest control. The troops had laughed at that. Pest control. After 3 tours on live fire fronts, this sounded like a holiday, a hazard bonus and a low-risk story for the bar. Nobody questioned why the biosigns looked so lumpy. From orbit, the infestation was just noise, patches of anomalous heat, movement patterns too slow and diffuse to be anything but herds or burrowing swarms. The atmospheric composition was worse than the briefing implied. Pressure higher, methane richer, trace compounds swirling like poison in the spectral analysis. But the helmets of the 3rd Expeditionary were rated for industrial disasters. The mission profile didn't change. They dropped at local midnight, when the upper methane haze glowed faintly with the reflected light of the system's moon. 6 landers knifed through the smog on pillars of fusion fire, their hulls glowing cherry red before slamming down on platforms that had not felt engineered weight in generations. Dust, fine, electrostatic hydrocarbon dust, billowed up around the landing struts and clung in a glittering skin to everything it touched. For a moment, the world was nothing but orange fog and the ticking ping of cooling metal. Then the fog cleared, and the Pest saw the exterminators. From a purely documentary standpoint, it was a beautiful shot. The derelict mining complex sprawled across the ridge like a rusted skeleton, gantries twisted by centuries of methane wind, reactor housings slumped and half-buried in frozen sludge. Light from the landers' flood lamps carved hard shadows across the broken ground. Tiny motes drifted through the beams, turning the air into a slow-motion snowstorm. On the ridge opposite, maybe 300 meters away, something straightened. It had been still as a pipe a second before, another vertical shape among dozens. Now it stepped away from the tangle of metal, with the kind of relaxed balance associated with organisms that had never fallen this far from their native gravity. Well, its limbs were long, jointed almost, but not quite where a biped's should be. An exosuit, a native. The sensor feed zoomed in automatically, focus sharpening. The thing wore a mask. It was a smooth oval, dark as void, with 3 round filters protruding like barnacles. Tubes ran from those filters, back into a carapace of matte plates, hugging a slimmer frame. Too slim for any known methane breather in the database, frost crusted every edge. Around its shoulders hung a cloak of something that moved with the wind but didn't quite match it, shedding sparkling dust. It watched the landers for a long heartbeat. Then, in a motion that would become very famous in certain tactical circles, it reached back, touched a rusted pipe as if knocking on a door, and vanished into the scaffolding. The mission clock read T+0 hours, 2 minutes, 13 seconds when they lost the first drone. The recon unit had been following standard pest clearance protocol. Launch a dozen small flyers, skim the immediate perimeters, map the extent of structural damage and larger fauna. The drones took to the air in a cloud of wings and rotors, pinging back neat streams of telemetry. Temperature gradients, movement signatures, air currents through broken bulkheads. One feed cut out mid-transmission, then another glitched, flickered, caught 3 frames of something pale and segmented, reaching up from below like a spider's leg, then static. Comp interference, the drone tech muttered, claws flying over controls. Old Terran mesh still broadcasting junk. I'll reroute. The 3rd drone died, with its camera pointed down at the landing pad. The last recorded frame showed one of the lander's legs. Next to it, half a meter high, a cluster of irregular lumps of metal and ceramic, looking suspiciously like tools. An improvised pile of parts. A workbench. The feed froze, then cascaded into noise. "Put a flag on that," the lander commander said. "We'll step around it." In the shadows under the pad where the lander's heat had not yet penetrated, something small and masked crouched amid its interrupted work and listened to the new sounds above. The local designation for those sounds, insofar as the locals had words for such things, was sky thunder. The translation was imprecise. Their language had grown around methane winds and the groan of old metal, the slow drip of hydrocarbons and the distant crackle of lightning through thick orange clouds. Fusion engines were new. They slotted into the existing framework, under the same rough category as atmospheric discharges. Dangerous, powerful, to be respected. The figure under the landing pad tilted its head. Sky thunder that stayed instead of passing. Many heavy footsteps. Voices, muffled by the hull, but unmistakable as voices. It clicked on its suit radio, heard only static, and made a decision. It unplugged the half-assembled coil of scavenged wire from the power tap it had so carefully installed, slung the coiled cable over one shoulder, and slipped away into the maze of service tunnels that honeycombed the complex. Call it curiosity, call it instinct, call it, if you like, one of those tiny narrative decisions that look much bigger in hindsight. By the time the first squad disembarked, the pest problem had already changed categories from unclassified fauna to potential hostile sophonts in 3 separate threat assessment subroutines. None of that had yet filtered down to the people actually walking onto the surface. Boots hit metal with a hollow clang. Atmosphere hissed around helmet seals as the gangway dropped. Major Callan of the Valkyrie Combine took the first step into the methane night with the weary confidence of someone who had done this on a dozen worlds. His armor was matte black, with a faint iridescent sheen, sleek lines broken only by the bulge of environmental systems, chunky gauntlets, full-face visor, rank sigils glowing amber on his chest. "All right, you know the drill," he said over squad comms. "Sweep, map, burn anything that tries to chew through your hoses. Fauna density is highest around the old vent arrays. Keep your filters hot." He hopped off the gangway and landed, with a deliberate thud that sent a vibration through the metal decking. Somewhere in the scaffolding above, frost crystals rained down in a fine glitter. Behind him, 10 soldiers fanned out. Their weapons were set to discourage rather than annihilate. Short-barreled plasma dispersers that could cauterize a charging beast without collapsing the building around it. Shoulder lamps cut cones of white through the murk. "Pest control," one trooper muttered. "Could have sent drones." "Corporate says fauna have been chewing cables," another replied. "Last reclamation team lost half their gear before they even unpacked. They want teeth on the ground." "You volunteering to explain to procurement why you fried half their atmospheric pumps with a drone strike?" Laughter hissed over the line. Nobody noticed the small movement on the ridge. The masked figure had reappeared, now accompanied by 2 more similarly dressed shapes. They lay flat along a rusted beam, cloaks blending with the metal, watching the strangers with lenses that glowed faintly green. The human word for the newcomers, translated roughly as gleamers. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was simply descriptive. Things that shone where nothing else did, bright in a world of matte frost. Things you could not look at straight on because the glare hurt your eyes. Sky things. Sky things had been stories, when the current elders were children, fragmented tales passed down from the last generation that remembered anything about the before had been a world you could breathe without a mask, unthinkable, where the sky was thin and blue, incomprehensible, and the structures were full of light, wasteful. Nobody alive had seen the before, but the stories remained, hanging in the communal memory like frozen breath. According to those stories, sky things came when the before ended. They had taken the ones who could not adapt and carried them away into the high dark. The ones who remained had learned to live in the after air. Light had become something you used carefully, in small amounts, because it attracted attention. And now, for the first time in a very long time, The sky things had come back. Down on the ground, Major Kalen's suit pinged softly as the first traces of complex hydrocarbons hit his filter array. He checked the readout, frowned. "Command, this is ground lead," he said. "We've got volatile levels higher than predicted. Methane plus a cocktail of other things I don't like. Request updated fire safety parameters." "Copy, ground lead," the orbiting operations officer replied. "We're adjusting your dispersers down 5%. Don't cook the atmosphere if you can help it. Corporate likes breathing." "Corporate isn't down here. Corporate likes you breathing too. You're expensive." He snorted, but tension eased a notch. Banter was good. Banter meant this was still normal. They cleared the immediate perimeter with textbook precision, tagging fallen girders and collapsed catwalks for later salvage. The usual scavenger biota scuttled out of the light and into cracks. Eyeless pale things that chewed methane ice and left behind trails of iridescent residue. One trooper vaporized something that came too close to a leg joint. Its death smell was sharp and sweet. "Nothing over half a meter," Callan said, scanning. "I've seen worse rat nests on cargo decks." "Give it time, Major," the logistics officer said. "We've barely scooped the surface." He was right. The complex wasn't just a surface sprawl. Terrans had always liked to build down as much as out. Beneath the rust and frost lay a layered warren of tunnels and shafts, maintenance passages and conveyors. The pre-methane atmosphere had been thin enough that humans had needed pressure to go deep. Now, the pressure outside made those depths safer than the surface. Heat signatures glowed faintly under the main superstructure. "I've got movement below," one of the scouts reported, clustered near the old pump cores. "Thermal profile. Huh, that's weird. Patching you the feed." Kalen's visor flashed as a new window opened. It showed a grainy thermal view of a corridor, walls coated in ice. At the far end, where the scanner barely reached, 3 bright blobs huddled around a fourth, dimmer one. The blobs pulsed, the dimmer one brightening, then dimming again. "In for communal thermoregulation," the squad's xenobiologist said automatically. "Like some Terran endotherms, huddling to share heat." "Size?" "About 1.8 meters from heat spread. Bipedal, if that's a stride pattern I'm seeing. Unclassified clade. Interesting." Callan shot him a look. "We're not on a field trip, Doctor. Are they a threat?" "Unknown. I'd advise non-lethal contact. Until we can—" The feed stuttered again. For a second, the blobs of heat scrambled. One went abruptly dark, as if a light had been switched off. The other scattered, streaks of warmth, vanishing into the walls. "What was that?" the ops officer demanded. "Not environmental," the xenobiologist said slowly. "That wasn't a heat source failing. That was an organism losing metabolic function." "That was something dying," Callan translated, "in our only clean line of approach." Silence scratched across the comm for a heartbeat. "Ground lead," command said finally. "Proceed with caution. Assume potential sapience, but corporate wants this site. Don't let a few nest squatters stall the operation." "Understood." He signaled 2 fire teams. "We're going inside. Watch your fields of fire. Safety on, until I say otherwise." He did not know that 5 decks below, the locals had just added a new warning symbol to the wall near the old pump cores. A simple scratch of 3 lines in a circle, meaning there was death here today, stay away. Humans are very good at learning to mark danger. They are less good, historically, at recognizing when something dangerous is trying very hard not to escalate. The first real contact happened at T+0 hours, 29 minutes and 41 seconds in a service tunnel wide enough to drive a Terran mining truck through. The Valkyrie moved in a staggered line, lamps cutting swaths of white through the amber gloom. Frost hissed under their boots. The tunnel's ceiling arched overhead, cables dangling in frozen loops, old Terran signage, long since scoured by wind and chemical fog, showed only ghost letters. "Reading increasing hydrocarbons ahead," the xenobiologist murmured. "Organic, not just atmosphere." The tunnel bent. Beyond the bend, the temperature dropped another 2 degrees. A strange rattling sound carried back to them, like a dozen tiny things tapping on metal in unison. "Drip formation?" one trooper suggested. "Granular sediment." They rounded the bend and stopped. In front of them, spanning the tunnel from wall to wall like a spider web from an engineer's nightmare, was a net. It looked crude at first glance, just lengths of cable and wire braided together, weighted with chunks of scrap metal. But the pattern of the braid was fractal, self-supporting, designed to distribute impact force along multiple vectors. The weights were not random either. Several were joint housings and structural braces from Terran machines, chosen for density and shaped by years of wear, so that their center of mass hung precisely where it needed to. The rattling came from the tiniest components, strung like beads along certain strands, little hollow spheres bumping against each other in the faint atmospheric currents, noisemakers. The net swayed gently in an invisible breeze. As the Valkyrie watched, one of the beads ticked against a cable and sent a shiver through the whole structure. "Oh," the xenobiologist said softly, "that's not fauna." From a hole in the wall above the net, 3 dark lenses watched them. Local designation, Cold Watchers. Function, monitor tunnel for large moving shapes. Behavior, retreat and report if bright shapes appear. Fear index, high. Aggression index, 0. The Cold Watcher in this tunnel had never seen anything like the Valkyrie before. The internal story it told itself, in the wordless way of instinct wrapped around inherited myths, went something like, sky shapes, light shapes, dangerous. They make thunder. But also, they were big. They could damage the net. The net took weeks of planning and days of finger-numbing work. The net caught the burrowers that ate insulation, and sometimes fingers. The net was important. The Cold Watcher shifted in its hole, drawing back, then leaning forward again. Finally it reached up, tapped twice on the maintenance pipe above its head, and disappeared. Far downstream in the tunnels, a string of relay taps carried the message. Tap, 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 tap. Sky shapes at net 3. Up in the tunnel, Major Callan took a cautious step closer to the net. "Looks like a trap," he said, "but not for us." "Trip lines at thigh height," the xenobiologist noted. "Weight tuned for something massing maybe 200 kilos. Low center of gravity. It'd be very effective against a quadruped." "Locals built this," Callan said, "which means locals have tools, planning, and probably language. That enough potential sapience for you, Doctor?" "More than enough. We should not damage this structure if we can avoid it. It's a valuable data point." Callan considered the net, considered the mission clock, considered the instructions not to compromise infrastructure. "Fine. We'll go around, mark it on the map." He turned, scanning the walls. Old Terran tunnels always had access hatches every few dozen meters. Maintenance crews were not fond of walking kilometer-long detours. Sure enough there, a hatch half buried in ice, wheel frozen solid. He stepped toward it. That was when the net moved. Not sagged, not broke, not collapsed. Moved. With a series of clicks and rattles, the entire structure slid sideways along guides that had been hidden under the frost. The trip lines lifted. One of the weighted braces rotated up and locked into a notch on the ceiling. The net made a passage where there had been none, doorway-sized and perfectly aligned with the hatch Callan had been about to use. The Valkyrie froze. In the silence, the sound of the beads was very loud. Did you see that?" one trooper whispered. "Of course they saw it," another hissed. "Shut up." The net swayed in its new position, inviting and menacing all at once. "Remote signal?" Command asked. "No transmissions," the comm tech replied, "at least none on our bands." "Mechanical activation?" "Negative. No obvious triggers." "Then someone moved it manually," the xenobiologist said. "Recently, which means someone is very close and watching us." As if to confirm his statement, something small dropped from the ceiling behind them, landed with a soft thump, and scuttled into a side conduit. It moved too fast to see clearly, just the impression of a small mask, 2 sets of gloved hands, and a trailing cable. One of the troopers spun, weapon up. "Contact! Hold your fire!" Callan snapped. His voice echoed down the tunnel. The Valkyrie stood in a rough triangle, weapons lowered but not relaxed, armor gleaming in the net's faint reflections. The tunnel waited. Nothing moved. Up in the walls, 3 cold watchers listened to their own hearts thudding in their ears and fought the urge to run. They had done what logic demanded, made space for the sky shapes to pass without wrecking the net. They had done what prudence demanded, stayed out of sight. Now all that remained was to see if the sky shapes were sensible. Sensible sky shapes went where the path was open and did not break things without need. That was how you survived in the after air. You fixed what you could and stepped where the structures had already been reinforced. Wasting effort was how you died. Major Callan did not know any of that. He only knew that choosing to walk through a trap someone else had just adjusted for you felt like stepping into a predator's mouth on purpose. "Thoughts?" he asked quietly. "If they wanted us dead, they wouldn't have moved the net," the xenobiologist said. "If they wanted us trapped, they wouldn't have shown us they could move it. This feels like a test." "Or a warning," a trooper muttered. "Or," the narrator might note, "a deeply ingrained cultural reflex toward minimizing structural damage in hostile environments." But nobody down there spoke that language yet. The silence stretched. "Command," Callan prompted. Up in orbit, the operations officer stared at the feed. Some part of his brain, the part that remembered Academy lectures on Terran cultural divergence, was whispering, "Abandoned colony 2 centuries. Plenty of time." But the file on Y976B said nothing about survivors. The atmosphere shift had been listed as total loss event. "Ground lead," he said finally. "This is above my pay grade. Stand by. I'm looping in xenocultural and legal." In the operations pit, several officers winced. You never wanted to hear from legal on a live channel. If legal got involved, it meant someone somewhere had already started drafting phrases like liability and culpability and acts inconsistent with council protocols regarding pre-contact civilizations. Down in the tunnel, the air grew colder. As Callan could feel the temperature change even through his suit. Filter systems working harder, pumps straining. The methane tinge in the air thickened, becoming almost a taste. "We can't stand here forever," he said. "If their atmosphere spikes, our filters won't keep up indefinitely." "Nothing spiking," the xenobiologist objected. "We're reading natural fluctuations within..." His suit pinged. "Correction. Methane concentration rising in this section. That's odd. No known geological source this close to surface." "Locals tinkering with vents," a trooper suggested. "Why would they?" The floor lurched. It was subtle at first, a gentle sway like the whole tunnel was breathing. Frost dust fell from the ceiling in soft curtains. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a deep hollow boom sounded, followed by another. "Seismic activity?" Command asked sharply. "Negative," the xenobiologist said. His voice was high now. "This isn't tectonic. It's pressure modulation. Someone's opening and closing valves." "You mean they're changing the internal atmosphere," Callan said, on purpose. The methane reading ticked up another fraction, then another. "Ground lead," Command said, voice tight. "You are to withdraw to the surface immediately. Do not engage further. Do not fire. Repeat, do not fire." "So now, it's a contact scenario," Callan muttered. "Now it's a possible first contact violation," someone from legal cut in. "Until we determine the legal status of the local population, you are ordered not to initiate hostile actions except in direct self-defense." Callan watched the net sway, watched the beads click, listened to the boom of distant valves breathing methane into the tunnels. He thought of rats on cargo decks. He thought of the way ships' air tasted after a slow leak. He thought distantly that it was very strange to be asked not to start a war with something that had not yet acknowledged his existence. "Understood," he said. He took a step back. "Squad, we're pulling out, slow and steady. Eyes on the net. Nobody trips anything." They began to retreat. Up in their holes, the cold watchers exhaled as one. They had not wanted to kill the sky shapes. Killing large things underground was dangerous. The old stories said that when you broke too much at once, the world fell on you. It was better if the sky shapes went away on their own. They had done the sensible thing. The sky shapes, miraculously, seemed to agree. As the last armored back vanished around the curve of the tunnel, one cold watcher reached out, touched the guide latch with careful gloved fingers, and let the net slide back into its ready position. The beads rattled once, then settled. Everyone, for the space of maybe 30 seconds, did the smartest possible thing they could have done. Then the surface team accidentally burned a village. Village was a generous term for it, of course. On the map, it showed up as Anomalous Heat Cluster B7, a knot of faintly warmer signatures, tucked into a depression between two ridges. It was downwind of a vent that belched richer methane twice every local day. The Valkyrie tracked it, because fauna nested near steady heat sources. The locals used it because the old Terran hab modules there were still nearly airtight. From above, the modules looked like half-buried cylinders, their outer insulation shredded by centuries of storm. Around them, the snow was trampled with narrow tracks, barely more than scratches in the frost, too light to trigger the Valkyrie's threat parameters. A few rusted antenna masts leaned at odd angles. Nothing moved. Second Squad approached with caution, but not fear. Their commander, Lieutenant Reth, had watched the tunnel feed with a grin and said something unwise about spooky nets and primitive engineers. He had not been told yet that command had elevated the locals to probable sapience. The comm lag between different parts of the sprawling complex was just long enough for trouble. "Looks abandoned," he said, sweeping his lamp across the nearest module. It gleamed dully, frost-scored metal, catching the light. Maybe some scavengers sheltering inside. "Heat signatures?" one of his troopers asked. Reth checked. The hearth-like glow in the module's center was faint now. Embers instead of a blaze. Residual. Whatever was here either left or went to sleep. "Standard pest procedure," another trooper said. That meant a quick burst from the plasma dispersers into any entrance points. Enough heat to discourage wildlife, sterilize nests, and clear out atmospherics without structurally compromising the habitat. It was a routine done on thousands of worlds where old colonies had gone feral. "Standard procedure," Reth confirmed. "Short burst only. Focus vents. Let's not roast the whole hill, people." They fanned out. Inside the module, 5 humans sat around a makeshift heater and argued. The heater was a salvaged reactor control core, gutted and repurposed. Someone had rigged a clever little heat exchanger, cycling warmed methane through pipes in the floor. The glow on the Valkyrie scanners was from that exchanger and from the humans themselves, bundled in layer upon layer of patchwork insulation. Their masks hung on pegs by the inner hatch, filters hissing softly as they dried. In the core's dim light, their faces were pale and angular, skin faintly waxy from a lifetime lived under heavy methane haze. Their eyes were large, pupils dilated, to catch every photon. Their hair, what they hadn't shaved for convenience, floated in fine strands around their heads in the convection currents. "Telling you, I saw them," the youngest was saying. "Bright like welding arcs. They came down on fire and then the fire went away, and the bright stayed." The eldest snorted, a sound like a filter clearing. "You saw lightning reflections on the upper pipes. You breathed too much vent gas. Your brain starts painting ghosts?" "They moved," the youth insisted. "They left footprints. I heard their steps all the way down to Net 3. The cold watchers tapped." The others glanced at each other. The tapping patterns weren't stories. They were real. "Even if they came," another adult said cautiously, "they came before and we're still here. Sky things take who they take and leave who they leave. We stay out of their way. They stay out of ours." "That's what you said about the burrowers," the youth shot back. "And then we had to build 5 nets." A ripple of resigned amusement went around the circle. "Fine," the eldest said. "We'll send a watcher topside at first light. If there are bright things, we can divert them. Turn the vents. Make it less comfortable where they walk." One of the wall plates near the hatch glowed suddenly with a warning pattern. A little old-world circuit someone had rigged up generations ago. Exterior pressure change. Heat where no heat should be. Everyone in the room froze. "Mask," the eldest said, with the weary, drilled tone of someone who had repeated this word to children since before they could walk. They scrambled. Filters clamped over faces, straps tightened with deft hands. The youngest fumbled one buckle, cursed, fixed it. The air around them hissed as the heater modulated output, compensating for the pressure shift. Then the ceiling boomed. From above, Reth's disperser looked like a quick flick of light. From inside, it sounded like the sky itself cracking. The plasma burst hit the module's outer rim, right above a forgotten hairline fracture in the insulation. Superheated metal expanded, strained, and finally gave way in a long, ripping shriek. The methane-rich air outside rushed in, slamming into the warmer, differently balanced atmosphere of the interior. Frost exploded across the breach, then vaporized. A shockwave rolled through the module, slamming the humans against the floor. The heater flickered. For a second, the Valkyrie scanners showed a flare of heat and motion. Then, the core's glow dropped to near zero. The central signature dimmed. Inside, one of the older humans had thrown themselves bodily across the heater, arms wrapping the makeshift exchanger, protecting the fragile assembly with their own body. The cold that hit them was not the simple absence of warmth. It was the presence of an atmosphere designed for a different kind of life. The methane burned in their lungs like ice. Their breath misted instantly, frosting the inside of their mask. "Shut it! Shut it!" someone wheezed, slamming the inner hatch controls. The fallback seals groaned, stuttering under pressure they had not been meant to bear. A second plate snapped into place with a judder that shook dust from the rafters. Silence. Then the thin, high keening of wind over new edges. The heater's output crept back up. The humans lay where they had fallen, hearts pounding, lungs burning. One of them did not get back up. On the surface, Lieutenant Reth glanced at his readings and saw only that the anomalous heat cluster had faded a little. "Looks like we cleared something," he said. Proceeding to next. His comm cut in, with the icy, too-calm voice of the operations officer. "Second squad, stand down. You are to cease all fire immediately. This is a direct order." Reth blinked. "Sir, we're following Pest protocols. Just cleared a nest." That nest shows signs of organized internal heat distribution and atmospheric regulation consistent with habitation. Legal is reviewing the footage now. Until we get a ruling, you do nothing without explicit authorization. Understood? The word legal did things to people. Even on the surface, in a methane storm, it carried the weight of tribunals and courts-martials. Reth swallowed. "Understood." "Good," Legal said, cutting in. "Because congratulations, Lieutenant. You may have just committed accidental manslaughter on a pre-contact population." The line went very, very quiet. Up in orbit, in a conference room, hastily sealed and flooded with its own clean oxygen, a cluster of very nervous specialists stared at freeze frames. One showed the net sliding aside. Another showed the pile of tools under the lander. A third, blown up and enhanced within an inch of its pixels, showed a pale human face behind a cracked mask, eyes squeezed shut against the glare of the Valkyrie lamps. The file on Y976B, once 3 pages, now sprawled across multiple holoscreens. Old Terran logs scrolled by, atmospheric readings, desperate notes about methane production, warnings about the failure of air recycling systems. In one, panicked handwriting overrode a typed report. "New children don't cough. They don't cough anymore. They just breathe it." "Abandoned colony, my frill," the xenocultural officer muttered. "They didn't die. They adapted." 200 standard years of isolation, another said, under atmospheric pressures like this, with no external support. How the hell are they still alive? "Terrans," someone else replied bleakly. "When their environment tries to kill them, they get better at living in it." One of the screens flashed, pulling up an old academic paper. Title: Methanogenic Transitional Adaptations in Hypoxic Human Populations, a Theoretical Framework. The footnote on the last page read, in small, almost apologetic text, data from Y976B indicates emergent traits not previously modeled. Further study pending. "Further study," the xenocultural officer repeated. "Looks like nobody ever did that part." On another screen, the live feed showed Valkyrie troops retreating steadily toward the surface, filters straining as methane levels ticked up. Down in the tunnels, cold watchers monitored their progress, and made little chalk marks on walls indicating safe and not safe. On the surface, in the ruined module, the humans dragged their dead toward the heater. They did not think in terms of war. They thought in terms of balance, of what you could change and what you could not. The sky things, bright and loud, were a danger, but no more so than the burrowers, or the methane flares that sometimes erupted from fissures without warning. You could not fight the sky. You could, however, make the sky uncomfortable. By the time the first reinforcements arrived in system, the locals had already begun doing exactly that. The reinforcements came because the first ship screamed. Not literally, of course. Ships don't scream. But the distress signal from the Valkyrie corvette in orbit had all the ragged edges of a vocalized panic. To any Combine asset in range, "This is the VCS Relentless on station at Y976B," the message said, compressed and rebroadcast through official channels. "Mission compromised. Local biosphere exhibits unexpected atmospheric modulation and probable sapience. Ground teams experiencing equipment failure and environmental hostility. We request immediate extraction and clarification of engagement protocols before we suffocate, burn, or litigate to death." There was a pause, then a second voice cut in. Major Callan, sounding very tired. Appendix. Recommend future scouting missions to Terran flag derelicts assume non-zero probability of surviving human descendants. This is not pest control. This is something else. The Combine took one look at the words Terran and unexpected in the same paragraph and dispatched a fleet. They were not warships, not officially. A task force of cruisers, a hospital ship, a diplomatic barge with hastily reassigned staff, a legal observer, a xenobiologist who had written 3 books on the ethics of encountering lost colonies and had never expected to be relevant outside of conferences. They translated into the system in a precise V formation, hulls glittering in distant starlight. Below them, the amber marble turned slowly, shedding a faint halo of methane as its upper atmosphere sputtered under solar wind. On Y976B's surface, the sky things became more numerous. The locals noticed. They noticed as they noticed everything, in the subtle shift of upper wind lightning patterns, in the way the glow through certain cracks grew brighter at different hours, in the faint new vibration under the old metal that meant more mass was hanging in the sky. They did what had worked before. They turned valves. Every mining complex on the planet had been built with atmospheric management in mind. Originally, that had meant pumping out methane to keep the air breathable. Later, when the oxygen crashed and the methane surged, those same systems had become the difference between suffocation and survival. Generations had learned to read the groan of pipes like a second language. There was a setting for venting dangerous buildups, a setting for diverting flows away from tunnels where a leak had sprung, and if you were very, very careful, a setting for making a particular region just unpleasant enough that large animals didn't like to linger. They had used that last trick on burrowers. They had never used it on sky things. The principle, however, was the same. Too much methane in some pockets, too little in others. Sudden eddies of heavier gas that made engines sputter and filters clog. The Valkyrie didn't realize the locals were doing it on purpose until one of the landers coughed mid-ascent and had to abort, slamming back onto the pad with alarms howling. "We've got stratified pockets," the pilot yelled into his mic, hands flying over controls. Atmospheres layering in ways that don't match the geological model. It's like someone's shaking the bottle. "Is it dangerous?" Command snapped. "For us, yes. For them." He sucked in a breath as a warning flashed. "They're swimming in it. They like it thicker." Up in the new flagship's ready room, the Admiral watched the data with a frown. "I thought this world was uninhabited," she said. "So did we," the Valkyrie captain said wearily. "In our defense, the last Terran report is 200 years old and mostly screaming." "What about the scouting drones? No visual indicators of settlements?" The captain brought up a series of images, derelict modules, frost-coated pipes, distant massed figures watching from ridges. "They don't build new," he said. "They reuse, retrofit. If there's a standing structure, they're inside it. If not, they're underground. This is a civilization built on not attracting attention." The xenobiologist leaned forward, eyes bright. That's actually fascinating. Given the hostile atmosphere, you'd expect... Doctor, the Admiral cut in. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but my primary concern right now is not writing a paper. She tapped a claw against the table, bringing up a zoomed feed from one of the tunnel cams. It showed the net, the beads, the way it had shivered and moved when the Valkyrie approached. They built that, she said, with scavenged Terran parts, without lowering the methane concentration enough to asphyxiate themselves. They are not animals. They are not simply locals. They are Terran-derived, technologically capable, and rightfully furious that someone just lit up their homes. We don't know if they understand causality at that level, Legal said too quickly. You try having your roof set on fire by strangers, and see how long it takes you to establish causality, the Admiral snapped. Silence. Options? She demanded. Full withdrawal. The legal observer said at once. We log the incident, pay reparations if contact is ever formally established, and never come back. That's a recommendation, not an option, the corporate liaison said smoothly. We-976b has half a planet's worth of methane reforming infrastructure, waiting to be restarted. The Combine's energy projections for the next century assume we bring this place back online. Walking away is not on the table. So we negotiate, the xenobiologist said. We signal, show them we can talk. We explain that the earlier incident was a misunderstanding. Assuming they don't suffocate our people while we're drawing pictograms, the Valkyrie captain muttered. On the planet, in a narrow maintenance shaft 3 levels below the main vent array, the youth who had seen the first landers wedged himself into a crevice and prepared to do something extremely unwise. He had spent the last 12 hours scurrying through pipes, listening to the sky things move. They were loud, they breathed wrong. Their footsteps rang. They shone. They also kept trying to go where they weren't welcome. He lay on his back under a valve wheel the size of his chest, gloved fingers wrapped around spokes, and counted heartbeats. Above him, he could hear the whistle of gas through the main vents. In the distance, faint and muffled, a noise like thunder, as another sky thing launched itself upward into the clouds. He braced his boots against the shaft wall, gritted his teeth, and turned the wheel. It fought him. Everything in the old complex did. It had been built for hands larger than his, for gravity slightly lighter, for an atmosphere that didn't coat every surface in oily frost. But his people had been turning these valves for generations. He knew exactly how much force he could apply before a seal cracked. Slowly, groaning, the valve shifted. Up in the entry tunnels, the Valkyrie felt the air change. Filters spiking, a trooper gasped. Methane levels. Something howled. It was not a voice. It was wind forced through a suddenly narrower aperture, shrieking down a shaft that had, for decades, been content to rumble. The note climbed higher as the pressure differential increased. Human ears had long since learned to ignore that kind of sound. It meant the pipes were doing as they should. To the Valkyrie, it sounded like the world itself screaming. "Retreat!" Major Callan shouted. "Now!" His voice was still echoing when his team felt the subtle tug of underpressure at their suits, the telltale sign of an environment shifting out of spec. They ran, boots hammering metal, lamps swinging wildly. In a side corridor, a cold watcher watched them go and chalked another safe arrow, pointing toward the nearest ladder. Both sides, in their own ways, were doing their best to keep the other alive. The universe has a sense of humor about such things. It was a small thing, in the end, that tipped the situation from dangerous to absurd. A detail, a misaligned assumption, a bit of timing. It was a child, not the youngest human on Y976b, not even particularly small, but to the Valkyrie, used to equating smaller size with lower threat. The figure that stepped into the floodlight at the edge of the landing zone looked like a juvenile. It stood at the top of a gantry, mask on, cloak snapping in the methane wind. Behind it, the orange haze of the sky boiled. Its silhouette was sharp against the glare. It raised one hand. The gesture was ambiguous. It could have meant halt. It could have meant hello. It could have meant, I'm about to do something incredibly stupid. The Admiral, watching from orbit through 3 different camera feeds, felt every spine on her back try to stand up at once. "Is that—" she began. "Yes," the xenobiologist breathed. "That's a human." "For the record," Legal said faintly, "we should consider this our first verified visual contact with a member of a lost Terran colony. Protocol dictates we attempt non-threatening." The child jumped. It didn't leap at them. It leapt off the gantry, one hand snagging a dangling cable, swinging under the beam with an easy, terrifying familiarity. Halfway through the swing, it let go, landed in a skid on the lower platform, and sprinted toward the nearest lander. Not in a straight line. That would have been too easy to intercept. It darted between crates under a support strut, over a coil of hose, body low, mask tilted just enough to keep them in view. "Do not fire," the Admiral said, which was redundant because half the Valkyrie on the pad were still trying to decide if what they were seeing was real. The child reached the lander. It didn't attack. It ducked under the hull, grabbed something small and rectangular, something that had fallen in the dust when the drone tech had dropped his toolkit in the first chaotic moments of landing, and then bolted away again, cradling the prize against its chest. The camera zoomed automatically. The object was a diagnostic pad, basic, ruggedized, with a little blinking screen. The human stopped just beyond the ring of lamps, turned back toward the lander, and raised the pad. The diagnostic interface flickered, adjusted. Some clever subroutine recognized a proximate user and defaulted to the most basic status screen: battery level, wireless link, nearby device list. On the feed, the xenobiologist saw the human's gloved thumb hover over the screen, then press. The pad obligingly pinged the nearest lander as a potential sink target. The lander's external lights flashed in acknowledgement. "All units, stand down," the operations officer shouted, voice cracking. "Do not respond to external sync requests. That's an unknown interface. Do not—" Too late. Somewhere in the lander's peripheral systems, a helpful autoconfig daemon, written by an engineer who had never considered this use case, said new maintenance console detected establishing handshake. The pad chirped. The human flinched, then tilted its head. On the screen, a list of icons appeared. Each one represented a system status: engine, environmental, comms, landing struts. The human tapped the one labeled with a simple symbol, an arrow pointing up. The lander's landing struts obediently retracted. The entire ship sagged, lurched, and then slumped onto its belly with a crunch that sent dust geysering up around it. On the surface, Valkyrie soldiers shouted and scrambled. Up in orbit, the Admiral swore in 3 languages. On the landing pad, the human stared at the fallen lander for a long second. Then very cautiously it tapped the icon again. The lander's struts tried to extend, realized they were jammed in bent housings, and screamed. It was not a healthy sound. The human made a small, startled motion, part apology, part satisfaction, and then turned and ran back into the maze of beams. The Admiral pinched the bridge of her snout and took a very slow breath. "Let me see if I understand this," she said to nobody in particular. "They've been living under a methane sky for 2 centuries, rewiring Terran infrastructure with their bare hands, and the first thing they do when they get access to our systems is disable our landing gear." "Technically," the xenobiologist said weakly, "the first thing they did was establish a successful wireless handshake under conditions of high interference. That's impressive. That can also be a very polite way to say, 'We own your toys now,'" the Admiral replied. From the planet's point of view, of course, it looked different. The youth who had swung under the gantry wasn't thinking in terms of systems or handshakes. He was thinking in terms of levers, valves, and the universal truth that if you pulled on something and something else happened, you could probably make that happen again on purpose. The bright shapes had brought a new piece of metal. It could talk to their sky machines the way old Terran tools talked to the pumps. If the bright shapes sky machine could be made to settle, to stay, to not leap back into the dangerous thin high where people could not go, that was good. If it stayed, you could climb on it, salvage it later, use its bones. He had tapped the up arrow because the symbol felt right. Up meant out of the deep tunnels. Up meant away from the crush. Up meant closer to the vent heat. Now, the sky machine had settled. It had complained, but it had stayed. He considered that a success. He did not know that, in doing so, he had just convinced an entire visiting fleet that his people were not only sapient, but technologically dangerous. In the flag briefing that followed, pest control officially died. It did so with very little ceremony. Nobody wanted to be the one to use the phrase out loud again. The incident was reclassified as unauthorized engagement with methanogenic Terran subpopulation. The mission priority shifted from secure infrastructure for reclamation to get our people out of there and find a way to make sure these humans never decide we're pests. We can't stay, Legal insisted again, more forcefully this time. Every minute we remain in this system after confirming the presence of an uncontacted Terran derivative population is another minute of violation exposure. The Council will have our hides and our funding. And if we run, the corporate liaison said through clenched teeth, every other polity in this sector will see the long-range methane signatures and come sniffing. You think the Terrans themselves are going to ignore a whole planet of their lost cousins? We need a stake in this before the Council lawyers even finish writing their first memo. The Admiral rubbed her temples. Is there, she said slowly, any indication at all that the locals are aware of us as separate from their old myths? Do they seem to recognize that we are not Terrans? The xenobiologist pulled up a loop of footage, the child with the diagnostic pad, the way he had looked at the symbols, the lander, his own hands. I don't think they have a concept for not Terran, she said. To them, anything that comes from the sky and shines like that is part of the same story sky things, before things. Maybe they notice differences. Maybe they don't. What they definitely notice is behavior. We set their roofs on fire. They turn the air against us. We stomp through their nets. They move them, instead of cutting us down. Which, Legal put in, we will emphasize in our eventual defense filings. Their restraint, our restraint, the mutual accidental nature of, Doctor, the Admiral said, how do they see us right now? The xenobiologist sighed. Big, clumsy, loud, fragile, poorly adapted to their atmosphere, dependent on shiny machines we keep breaking, she said. If they have a concept for pest, we're in it. We're the ones chewing through their cables. And they're dealing with us, the Admiral said slowly, the way they deal with burrowers. By making the environment uncomfortable, steering us away from critical areas, and occasionally trapping our equipment, the xenobiologist agreed, they don't seem to be trying to kill us. They're trying to get us to leave. The Admiral leaned back in her chair and laughed once, without much humor. So, she said, recap. We came here on a job labeled Operation Pest Control. We have discovered a human subspecies that has, so far, treated us as a nuisance to be mitigated, rather than an enemy to be eradicated. And my troops are sending me messages from the surface, saying things like, please get us out of here before the locals decide our existence is inconvenient. Nobody contradicted her. Fine, she said. Then we give them what they want. We leave. But we do it in a way that doesn't look like a rout, because I am not going to be the Admiral who explains to the Council that an entire fleet fled from a colony that doesn't even know it's at war. She tapped the table. Signal the ground teams. New orders. Priority is extraction. No more incursions. No more pest procedures. If they have to choose between shooting and retreating, they retreat and get me a channel. Open broadcast. Broad spectrum. I want to at least try to say sorry before we go. On Y976B's surface, in the shadow of the disabled lander, Major Kalen's suit pinged with the new directive. Finally, he muttered, you heard the lady. We're going home. Half his squad cheered. The other half simply sagged with exhausted relief. They began the careful, painful process of detaching from a hostile environment, reclaiming sensor buoys, shutting down external generators, marking everything they couldn't take with beacons for future retrieval. The skies above them rumbled as more ships adjusted orbits, vectoring their burn patterns away from the densest methane layers. In a tunnel far below, the youth who had turned the valve felt the change as a subtle relaxing in the pipes. Less pressure, less strain. He waited, counted heartbeats, then turned the wheel back to its neutral position. It fought him again. Everything did, but it moved. Up in orbit, the xenobiologist's sensors registered the methane gradient smoothing, the vented pockets equalizing, and somebody, somewhere, was putting the environment back the way it had been. "See," she said softly, "they don't hold grudges against the air. They need it too." The Admiral didn't answer immediately. She was watching a different screen. The broadcast channel had been open for nearly an hour now, cycling through the basic contact icons the Council's linguists had agreed on: star, planet, ship, stick figure. The Valkyrie had added their own variations, their own simplistic shapes: a stylized hand with the palm out, the universal sign for no harm, a ship lifting away from a planet, an arrow pointing down, then a ship, then an arrow pointing up. We came. We are leaving. They had no guarantee any of it would make sense to people whose ancestors had last seen Terran symbols 2 centuries ago. But symbols had to start somewhere. And then, in a narrow maintenance bay where someone had once patched an old display screen into a power feed for extra warmth, the cycling icons appeared. The room was empty at first. Then a child wandered in, drawn by the sudden glow. He stopped in front of the screen, mask filters hissing. The shapes were simple, bright. They repeated: star, planet, ship, stick thing, hand, ship up, star. He watched them cycle twice. Then he reached out, tentative, and touched the hand. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The display was one way. The signal was broadcast, not interactive. Still, he left his hand there, fingers spread on the cold glass. His people had no word for forgiveness that translated cleanly. They had, instead, a word that combined the ideas of, "We survived that," and "We can live with this." It carried the sense of shrugging off bad vent gas and patching a leak. Let it be. Standing there in the glow of a dead Terran monitor showing alien icons, the child thought that word to himself. Then he turned and ran off to tell the others that the sky things were leaving. On the landing pad, Major Callan's squad formed up for the final lift. Masks scratched, armor scuffed, filters stained with methane residue, they looked less like an elite unit and more like a crew of miners who'd been lost in the shafts for a week. They clomped up the gangway, boots leaving deep dents in the frost. Callan paused at the top. Something moved on the ridge. For a second, his heart leapt into his throat. Nets, valves, methane storms, exploding landers. All the ways this could still go wrong flashed through his mind. Then he saw the shape clearly. It was one of them. The locals. Human by way of methane and necessity. Mask on, cloak wrapped tight against the wind. It stood straight, watching the lander's lights. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand. This time, the gesture was unmistakable. Palm out. No harm. Callan found his own hand rising, almost without conscious thought. The suit's heavy gauntlet ensured the motion lacked the grace of the others, but the shape was the same. Palm out. We're going. The human held the pose for a heartbeat longer, then turned away, cloak snapping, and vanished back into the scaffolding. Later, in reports and debriefs and endless legal reviews, Callan would describe the gesture as mutual acknowledgement of non-hostile disengagement. The transcripts would use phrases like implicit understanding and provisional peace. Historians would argue about whether it counted as the first formal contact between the Combine and the methanogenic Terrans of Y976b. The locals, for their part, would tell the story in much simpler terms. They would say, once, the sky things forgot we could live here. They came down and broke some of our roofs. We turned the air and moved the nets, and the sky things learned they went away. We fixed what we could. The pipes still groan, but they always groaned. Life goes on. As the lander engines roared and the ship lifted, methane fog swirling in its wake, the Admiral watched the planet shrinking in her viewport. Operation Pest Control, she said quietly. What an idiotic name. The xenobiologist, strapped into the seat beside her for once instead of hovering over a console, smiled tiredly. You could rename it in the logs, she suggested, something more accurate. The Admiral considered. Operation Begging Not to Be Considered Vermin. By humans who don't know we exist, she said dryly. Bit long, the xenobiologist said. Maybe just Operation. Lesson learned. Not bad, the Admiral admitted. She keyed in a note for the mission archive. Primary objective, aborted. Secondary objective, survival. Tertiary objective, do not, under any circumstances, allow anyone to schedule pest control on a Terran-tagged world ever again. She hesitated, then added one more line. Recommendation: when humanity eventually comes looking for their lost methane-breathing cousins, we greet them politely, offer all sensor data, and make it very clear that we did our best not to break anything once we realized whose backyard we had wandered into. Because that, in the end, was the heart of it. They had not been chased off by an army or a fleet or a declaration of war. They had been managed, steered, tolerated, and for a galaxy that had spent centuries classifying humans as apex predators and extinction-level events, there was something uniquely humbling about being the side that slunk away while the predators stayed home, unaware they'd just won. In the methane haze of Y976b, a child climbed onto the now-settled husk of a disabled lander and sat there, watching the fading glow in the sky where the ships had gone. He patted the metal under his gloved hand. Stay, he told it, in the language of pipes and vents and sensible things. You'll make a good roof. He had never heard the word war. He knew about burrowers and leaks and the way the sky sometimes forgot itself and threw lightning where it shouldn't. He knew about nets and valves and how to read the groan of old metal. If someone had told him, then and there, that his people had just fought off an interstellar incursion by one of the Combine's more competent expeditionary forces, he would have tilted his head behind his mask and said something like, "We just didn't want them chewing through the cables." Somewhere far above in the clean air of space, the Admiral, who had just retreated from that very same cable chewing, made a note never to underestimate a human population again, especially not one that had adapted so well to a world trying to kill them that an alien invasion registered, at most, as an especially annoying infestation.